Hello and welcome to Noclip's second guest documentary, and it's very first to be delving into a studio based out of England, which means of course the weather is dreadful, but we'll press on regardless. So we're here to tell the story of Creative Assembly, a studio that began its life in a spare bedroom porting other people's games, but grew into something much more significant. It's perhaps best known for just a couple of words. As short as those words may be, they hold some real significance for strategy fans around the world, and of course, those words are Total War. Now this is a studio I visited plenty of times over the course of my career, usually to take a look at the latest Total War project, or more recently with People Make Games to find out about a bizarre television show that somehow got made in the early 2000s. But despite a dozen or more trips, until now, I'd only seen one side of Creative Assembly, the PC strategy powerhouse. But there is another side. These days they're known as the console team, and they're the folks behind games like Alien Isolation and Halo Wars, and they've actually been around since the very beginning. They even predate Total War altogether.
I joined in, I think, like 93-ish. Yeah, working in one room above an estate agent's. 3 coders working exclusively in assembly language, the language which has all kind of one-to-one mapping with processor instructions, and bears no resemblance to anything that's human readable, and is just kind of, to do the simplest task, you've got to write reams of code. And so that's where the name of Creative Assembly comes from.
This was just before we seriously started thinking about Total War. We were making sports games for Electronic Arts, and we were making the kind of niche sports games, I guess. The guys had done FIFA on PC, and then I think Electronic Arts had asked us to look at some other sports. It's kind of a really good apprenticeship, because maybe when you kind of get into video games development, you kind of think, I've got this burning desire to make my game. And actually it was pretty healthy to be able to kind of get into something like that, where you know there's an audience and they know what they want, and you need to make a game that they're really going to fall in love with.
Mike Simpson joined, he was our producer at Psygnosis, and so he was a kind of a guy with kind of industry clout and an understanding of game design.
So I joined Creative Assembly in '96, but I'd been working with the founder of Creative Assembly, Tim Ansell, for probably 5 or 6 years before that. I was working as a producer for a publisher, Psygnosis, and he was a sole developer when I first met him, working on ports of various PC games, very early PC games in fact. There were 5 people when I joined. So yeah, the reason I joined CA was not to make the Total War series of games. I wanted to make an RPG. That was the thing I was into at the time, and I joined up with Tim, where we were going to make an RPG based on Monkey Journey to the West, and we were going to do it in Singapore. Right, so the idea was I'd join and we'd set up a new studio in Singapore, because there were these massive government subsidies there. It became fairly clear that all of those subsidies had huge strings attached, and it turned out that making games in Horsham was pretty much as good as making them in Singapore. So we decided to stay. While we were looking into the Singapore thing, a number of things happened. I mean, first we noticed that there are a lot of people making Command and Conquer clones. Like Command and Conquer had been out for a little while. There were a lot of games like Kill, Crush and Destroy, which were really quite easy-looking games to make, and they were doing really well. And we thought, okay, well, maybe we should put the whole RPG thing on hold for a while, and make one of these quick and easy Command and Conquer clones. But also, at the same time, the first 3D card came out, the 3DFX, and the kind of thing that in the past you wouldn't have been able to consider doing suddenly became possible. So rather than having a top-down view, like all of the previous Command and Conquer games, we thought about, okay, well, what if we start tilting the camera down and putting you in the general's eyes, and having a rolling landscape. And because of those 3D cards, a rolling landscape was suddenly a thing that you could do, whereas before everything was square angles and corners. And out of that, and a few experiments with flocking, we ended up with this medieval battlefield with lots and lots of little guys and a general's viewpoint. And that started to evolve into Shogun Total War.
So when I came here for my interview, they took me around and they showed me a pre-release build of Shogun Total War, which hadn't been announced. So in my sketchbook, I had this, idea for a game where you control an army, but you don't control the individual guys. You control these groups of guys, and you move and fight, and you take over territory. And I thought, oh my God, this place is awesome. Even if they're just hiring me to work on sports games, I just want to be around, this kind of awesome creative thing that they're working on. But it was quite different back in those times because the games industry, you can say that it started in the 70s or in the 80s, but for me as a 3D artist, it really started in the mid to late 90s. That's when all the tools changed, when the games went from being top-down or side-scrolling to having full 3D views. I was an experienced 3D game developer. I had 3 years of experience, and that was a lot back then.
With the 3D cards, one of the programmers, who was actually a pretty good mathematician, had this idea of turning spline-based grid into a landscape. To our great surprise, that actually worked. I don't think anybody expected that to work in real time, and it worked. And suddenly there were all these little guys running across the landscape. And that's the point where we thought, okay, that we could start making really quite big battlefields that way. And from there, we evolved into wrapping up those battles with a turn-based strategy wrapper. I think the turn-based strategy part probably ends up being slightly more than half of the game in the end. And the battles themselves, they're fun and they're interesting, but as an experience on their own, they're not really enough to keep you coming back and back and back and back. The characters that turn up on the battlefield, you need some context. And it wasn't really until we started getting backing from EA that we had enough time and budget to be able to think about it properly and say, okay, let's design something which is going to be more than the sum of the parts out of it. We started off with just using Japanese content for our first demo. I mean, it provided a great setting which was reasonably simple, right? So there weren't too many different troop types, and we could have this kind of Zen simplicity thing running through it without making it too deep and complicated. So CA since I joined, there always were two teams. So when I joined, there were 5 people. When I joined, they were all busy making, I think it was a Rugby World Cup game when I first joined. And they stayed doing that, making sports games for EA for quite a while, and then went on to make action games, and they're still there. It's the same team that made Alien Isolation and Halo Wars 2 and so on. And alongside them, gradually the Total War team grew. So by the end of Shogun 1, there were probably 15 or 16 of us, which sounds ridiculously small now.
Why do you think Creative Assembly didn't go all in on one of those two things? Because they both sound like they had, like, Shogun was obviously a success, although maybe had a longer tail on it than some of the sports stuff, and the sports games were doing really well in their own right. Like, how come Creative Assembly didn't become a studio that just did one of those two things?
Tim Ansell is a shrewd businessman, and it was, during those early years, studios came and went pretty rapidly, especially small studios. And so having speculative projects and safe projects going simultaneously is obviously a very good way to run a business.
Now, you may have noticed that there's a fairly significant part of the Creative Assembly story that we are missing at present. Although we've been very lucky to interview some real veterans from the studio, people that have been there 10, 20 years, there is one person that we haven't spoken to as of yet, the founder of Creative Assembly himself, Tim Ansell. And, well, that's because he doesn't work here anymore. Following the acquisition by Sega in 2005, he left the studio, and not on particularly good terms either. But I feel it's important that we do talk to him if we're going to tell the history of Creative Assembly, and so that's where we're off to next. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, I can't take Noclip's wonderful camera operator, Jeremy, with me, and so, sorry Jeremy, the camera footage is going to take a slight dip in quality over the next few minutes. Forgive me for that.
Well, originally I kind of left school with no qualifications at all, really, and ended up getting the first job I got offered, which was working in the print room of an architect, and did that for a few years, and they started sending me to They released to college to become an architectural technician, which I wasn't interested in, and along the way they bought a Apple II computer to work out all sorts of engineering calculations, and it kind of caught my interest. So I asked the boss if I could have a go, and he said fine. So I used to spend my evenings teaching myself to use an Apple, an Apple Soft Basic, and then went on to 650 assembly language. And then when I was at school, at college, I got a lucky break because one of my mates there, he said, I've got a mate who runs his own computer company, I'll give him your number if you like. So I just went, yeah, all right, whatever, because people say that all the time, don't they? And anyway, much to my amazement, next week he came in and said, I saw him down the pub and there's his number, give him a call. Like, oh, what? Wow, okay. So that was a guy called Graham Devine, who subsequently went on to write Seventh Guest.
Right.
And but yeah, I worked for him for about 18 months or so, and till that went pop, and then I found myself on my own, and that's how I got started.
So the original plan was just as a one-person entity then?
Didn't really have a grand plan, to be honest. It was just have a job mostly, but I've just always been someone that's sort of seen opportunities and taken them when they come along, rather than been a great visionary with a grand plan. So I just found I was getting offered far more work than I could cope with, and so it seemed silly to turn that down. Plus I saw very early on that the day of the one-man band was disappearing, so it was a case of grow or die, really. Yeah, I hired my first 2 employees 1989, just before my first son was born, and I remember the first one worked in the spare bedroom at home, and then my son was born and we needed that back, so I went and got a first little 200 square foot office above an estate agent.
EA Sports, it's in the game.
Often when you call a large company, it's so crucial who it is you get put through to. You get put through to the wrong person, it's probably the end of the line. And I got put through to a guy called Matt Webster, who happened to be the associate producer on a new game they were doing. And when he told me it was a football game, to be quite honest with you, I thought, that sounds a bit sad. But I tried to sort of retain an enthusiastic tone just in case I wanted to do it. So yeah, I then went up to meet them fairly soon after. And I was really blown away by their enthusiasm and passion for everything, really. They seemed like a really nice bunch of guys, and it seemed a very friendly atmosphere, and they were absolutely desperate for me to start. I can't even begin to tell you. Like, before we'd even signed a contract, literally the next day they sent down a taxi with a Mac in it with all the source code on so I could get started.
Right. We should probably say which football game that was.
Well, at the time it was known as FIFA International Soccer, which I guess is generally now known as FIFA 94, even though the numbering didn't start till the next version. And of course it wasn't released at the time, so nobody had any idea how big it was going to be. I think, to be fair, nor did they. Yeah, at the time FIFA really opened doors for us. You know, you just mentioned, I mean, obviously I didn't write FIFA, we just ported it onto the PC, but nevertheless, if you went around telling people you just worked on the PC version of FIFA, then every door you can imagine just, swung open.
Santa Maria, Mboku, Nigeria offside.
The commentary actually came about completely by accident, really. I was just in the office on my own one night. EA were doing the sound effects and they hadn't given them to me yet, and I wanted to crack on with the audio code. So in order to check it out, I just decided to record some placeholder sound effects just to check them. So I literally said the names of all the sound effects. So it was like pass 1, pass 2, ref whistle, 1, ball, hit post sort of thing. And I literally just spoke those things in a monotone voice and played them back, played the game and checked they're all being triggered in the right places. But then when this happened, I realised that it kind of sounded like a weird, rudimentary commentary. So subsequently came up with the idea of recording the 3 phrases, everything with to and by and on their own. So you'd have like Smith, pass to Smith, kick by Smith sort of thing, and then you could chop them all up and put it with all the other phrases.
Strike by Favaro!
To me, the voice of commentary at the time was Tony Gubber. And so I literally just asked EA, can we get him? And very quickly they just came back and said, yeah, I think somebody knew his agent or something. And they very quickly came back and said, yeah, we got him. So I booked a recording studio near Crawley that I'd used personally making music, and we spent the day recording him. And he was a ledge.
Tim was loving it, hobnobbing with the Gubber with his comb over and all that business.
But he didn't complain once. He was really good, and he was sort of screaming away for us. That certainly helped. Gave us put us on the map a bit. Gave us a bit more kudos. But then we took several steps backwards by agreeing to do a rugby game for them, just because I sort of liked EA at the time.
Continued working for Electronic Arts, doing kind of every sort of sports game known to man, with a kind of an oval ball and a small ball, and we did them all, kind of rugby league, rugby union, Australian rugby league, Australian rules football, World Cup cricket, World Cup rugby, all of that kind of business. And so that was paying the bills.
EA understandably want the same level of quality across their sports brand, obviously, but a game that's going to sell millions of units like FIFA can obviously command a big budget, and a game that sells maybe 120,000 units like some of these other ones doesn't. And so trying to produce a game to the same production values as that was hard work for very little money and very little kudos. So it became clear quite early on that the only way we were going to make any money really was to do something original. So yeah, it had been in the plan for some time, and I think the final kicker for me was a very lazy Command & Conquer clone that came along that EA were releasing, that I seem to remember had a sales forecast of 450,000 units. And I thought, holy cow, there's us busting our balls to do this stuff for 120,000 units and little kudos, and there's this that of course they like more because it's got a much bigger sales forecast and it hasn't got one original idea. And so we could do better than that without even getting out of first gear. So that definitely, that's it, we're doing it. Normally, original game development is a Monte Carlo or bust scenario. All the guys who create a new game and it's successful, you'll hear about them, they're the latest success story, and off down the Ferrari garage, but you don't hear about all the ones who fail, and they probably don't own a house anymore. And obviously at the time I had a wife and 2 young kids and didn't really much fancy that scenario. Plus, I also had a few employees by then who also paid their mortgages based on what I pay them, so I took their security seriously as well. So I decided to try and do it a sort of a slower, safer way. If Shogun hadn't worked, we would have survived. So that we ran the sports teams as a way of keeping the company running, and so if Shogun had been a complete and utter disaster, it would have been bad, but we would have still been there, we could have still picked ourselves up and gone on and tried something else. And so we really were genuinely aiming for sort of a B- title, just to sort of show people, look, we do know how to write original games. The only where we didn't compromise was I knew it had to be 3D. The more we did of it, the more we could see the potential. We saying, this is good, and so we'd go back to the guys that were funding it and say, look, well, bit more time, bit more budget. We really think you might have something here, and that's how it kind of started to grow into Shogun that eventually ended up selling 1 million units.
When we finished Shogun, we actually started on Rome and Medieval at the same time. Right, so Rome took a long time to make. It was 4 years. It wasn't really until we finished Medieval 1 and the whole team started focusing on it that it really started to come together. When we're trying to pick what to do next, pretty much everything you can imagine is on that list, and we're just arguing about the order in which we're going to do things. Rather than trying to figure out what's going to sell best or anything like that, we basically just make the game that we want to play most. And Medieval just seemed to be like the most fun. We wanted to do more with castles and sieges and so on, and that seemed like a good way to push it forward. Those first 2 years, we ended up with 2 years of work, and we looked at it and thought, this isn't actually very good. We actually went back to Activision at that point and said, we're going to need more time, and they gave us another year. We had planned to make it a year quicker.
Everything was new, and there was a very loose template in Shogun 1 that we could follow, but we pretty much changed everything. So we changed the way the campaign map worked entirely. So we went from the region-based map to the very open world campaign, and with the 3D models, there was a lot more we could do on the battles to make them exciting.
So yeah, doing everything in 3D for the first time, building a 3D engine that could display thousands of men. There was nothing else that could do that at the time. Nothing else got close. So it needed to be really, really, really efficient. It was things like building cities where the buildings in the city matched what was on the campaign map, right? Which sounds like a really small thing, but that actually cost a lot of effort. So it's actually, I guess that's a surprising thing about all the Total War games. It may actually be quite small things in them which end up sinking huge amounts of the effort, and sometimes it's surprising where those end up being. Shogun 1's a good example of that. The throne room in Shogun 1 took just more than a quarter of the total budget of the game, just for that one scene of guys coming in and out of a throne room and speaking a bit.
Oh my God.
That was hard.
Yeah.
Warriors of Sparta! Today, our city faces her greatest enemy.
When we first had Spartan to pitch, when Activision dropped it and we got it back to pitch it, literally Sega were the first people we pitched it to, or I tried to. I phoned them up and left a message, heard nothing, tried again, and eventually gave up and tried all sorts of other people. And that year, all in all, was the worst year of my life. And when I tell you that subsequent year, getting divorced, which everyone will appreciate is bad, no, that year was worse. Yeah, and then the irony of it was things were getting pretty desperate. How I was running out of irons in the fire. And then one day I'm in the office and somebody says to me, "There's a phone call for you, there's a guy from Sega." Picks up the phone, he says, "Oh, hi, my name's Gary Rowe and I'm new product acquisition manager or something for Sega. I wonder if by chance you might have any product we might be interested in." And unfortunately, I have to say my words to him were, "Are you taking the piss?" Because I just couldn't believe this. And, I said, I phoned you 6 months ago. He's like, he never got any of the messages. So once they got that, then things moved real quick. And I really liked Sega. I thought they were a really good fit for CA. And they liked us. And yeah, it worked well because they were just a good fit from the beginning.
I'm right in thinking from pretty early on they like mentioned the word acquisition, like they might be interested.
Yeah, they said, like, from the first get-go, they said, "Oh, after we've been working together a few months, we might like to start talks about acquisitions." And okay, fine, sure, whatever. And then probably after about 3 weeks, they said, "Oh, we'd like to start those talks." I said, "I thought you wanted to work together for a bit." Then, we know each other. So yeah, it was quite quick, yeah.
And what was your feeling at that point? You said that you just had a pretty rough year and found the job and the responsibility, I guess, quite stressful.
Mm.
Did you see that as like a way to take a step back, or did you have conflicting feelings, or how did you feel about the idea of selling?
Well, that's the thing, because as well as the company, there's me as a person, and I'd been working really hard for 18 years with a lot of stress, and as you will probably appreciate with the divorce comment, a few personal issues going on in the background as well, and everyone has their breaking point, and I had 100% reached mine, and I've been through, along the way, 3 full-on bouts of suicidal depression, and I was spent. I was completely shot. And me personally, I needed to get out. I actually didn't want to leave. I just needed a break, and I really should have just negotiated or tried to negotiate myself a sabbatical. And I kind of regret that. But I didn't, and I was just so desperate to get out of there. I just did exactly that. And that's one of my regrets, really, because I'm sure everybody just thought that I was after the money and then just was off. But the truth of the matter is, once the sale went through, I hadn't really seen much of my kids for such a long time, and I was just so spent after that tough year we'd had, and obviously all the personal issues that were going on. But to be honest, I had a 6-month contract with Sega, and I didn't even go into the office that much, really, which is it's hardly surprising. When September came, they got rid of me, really. I was about as much used as a chocolate teapot, and which is a shame, but again, probably made everyone think he's lost interest, which I hadn't, but like I said, I just personally was done, and I needed a break, and it took me quite a few months, probably a year, to really get my shit back together. It was one of those things, I wanted to be able to leave, I didn't want to actually leave. I wanted the pressure of having to be there to go, but I didn't want to actually go. The money sort of lifted all that stress from me, so that I don't have to worry about that anymore. But it was weird. I was in such a bad place at the time that, to be honest, I felt really ashamed, and I actually couldn't go in the office. I sort of felt I'd let everybody down.
What did you feel ashamed about?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, she's a bit emotional. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd always espoused how good it was being an independent developer, and then I'd gone and sold, and I sort of felt, again, because I wasn't turning up much, that everyone would think I was just after the money and I didn't care, and none of that was true. And then what made it worse was then when I left, Sega censored my, sort of departing note to strip it of any emotional content, so I couldn't really say anything other than bare basic facts, so I couldn't even tell anybody how I actually even felt. And it had been it was my life for 18 years, On September the 4th, I was a husband, a full-time dad, a boss whose opinion on everything mattered, and at the centre of something good and creative and whatever. And on September the 5th, I was none of those things. I was single, I was a part-time dad, and the biggest decision I'd make all week was what to eat for dinner. And it took me about a year or two to actually stop checking my emails every 15 minutes.
Right.
It's like, no one emails you, Tim. It's just spam.
Start, Tim, with your full name and job title.
Yes, my name is Tim Heaton. I'm the studio director here at Creative Assembly.
Cool. So you joined the team as studio director in 2009.
Yeah.
Well, how big was the studio at that point? How many people were?
We were 90 people at that stage.
90. Okay. And do you know how many people are here now? Roughly?
There are 580 altogether. Here in Horsham and in Sofia. We were just finishing Total War Empire. There was a console game just out, Viking Battle for Asgard. You know, I thought it was a kind of really interesting game, really good, but not finished, but not being allowed to really kind of bring all its goodness to the fore. So I realised there were two teams, really, two things to do. And one was to look at Total War and like look at opportunities with that, because it was a hugely respected franchise then. It seemed like people were kind of really interested in where Total War would go next. And then there was a console team here, the team that had delivered Viking. They're in different buildings. We've only had to do that because we kind of ran out of space in this building. But they are in two different buildings, and they're two different teams, and they have, real different vibes. Obviously, the Total War one is quite collegiate, quite studied, and the console team is a little bit more rock and roll. What we call the command team on that team are really passionate about pushing different places to go within gaming. So, yeah, that team is very much the one that will experiment.
Rome is not the only power rising along the shores of the Mediterranean. Another people, the Carthaginians, have imperial ambitions.
If you go back and look at Rome, it's a bit cartoony. It's a bit, the tech is quite like hand-painted textures. So it did have a bit of a stylized, hand-painted look to it, which is something that we have dropped over the years. So we've become a more kind of gritty, real looking, but we always want to shovel some style on top of it as well.
We have to be very methodical in how we make these things true to history. So it's a massive challenge of that, and someone will always point out something that's not exactly right.
So my number one thing about looking at the art direction for Total War is it's not exactly authenticity. So the way I look at it is, if you think of a Greek Spartan warrior, right? This image of a helmet pops into your head, which is probably going to be a Corinthian helmet. And there's a certain perfect looking Corinthian helmet that is the most quintessential Corinthian helmet. That's the Corinthian helmet that we want to use in game, is the iconic version of it. So all these other Corinthian helmets are authentic, but there is one Corinthian helmet that is the quintessential one, and that's the one we want to use.
So getting back to the Shogun content for Shogun 2, it was really nice to go back to that familiar stuff that we'd all got so immersed in the first time round, and with all of the changes in tech since then, we had a chance to do it again and do it much, much, much better. It let us focus a lot more on the art side than we'd been able to do before, so it's the first time we'd really tried to make a project that was art-led rather than tech or design-led.
We decided then to go on a very stylized approach for movies. We did these woodblock painting style movies for events and stuff like that, and that was great fun to work on. And we had this very talented artist who could amazingly recreate these really traditional looking paintings, but and no one believed that they were original. Everyone was like, where did you steal these from? And it was a smaller scale, I think, in another term. So yeah, it probably was more art-led. We weren't going into the whole massive expanses of a giant map or something. It was just the campaign was smaller, but we could put so much more detail art-wise.
it was nice to pursue the kind of Zen simplicity thing. One of the most difficult things when making any games is to make a game which is deep but simple, and with Total War, in some ways it's even harder because we've always got a rich feature set, and making that deep but not complicated is really, really hard. And Shogun gave us a really good platform to have a good go at boiling the game down to its essentials and making something that was reasonably simple but still very, very deep.
Yeah, the big changes since I've been here are we knew that people would happily take more Total War content, right? That we had these fans that were vociferous and were expectant for every single release. So we wanted to think about that, and we wanted to think about not tying teams into really strict deadlines as well. And I think running multiple teams lets you be a bit more dynamic, so you can concentrate a bit more on quality. So we set out with a strategy to build more than one game team. That is incredibly difficult for Total War because there are all these specialists, right? Everybody on a Total War team is a specialist, and you can't just clone them. So we have a battle AI specialist, campaign AI specialist, etc. They've been with the company for years, and it was a bit, well, how do we find more of those people? So we went out looking, and it took us 5 years, I think, to find a set of skills where we could start thinking, right, second team.
As much as this documentary is about the exponential success of Creative Assembly and Total War over the years, it's not always been smooth sailing. Fans of the series will remember one game's launch in particular, Total War Rome 2 in 2013, a game that arrived with its fair share of problems.
There was so much that we wanted to get into the original game. We were so ambitious with that game. We wanted to take everything that everybody loved about the first game and make it so much better that we probably were too ambitious with it. And it did take us a long time after release to really get to the point where we could look at it and go, yep, that's the game we actually were intending to make.
We made a mistake, and it was the studio that made the mistake, or I made that mistake. We decided to go ahead and launch that game, and it wasn't quite ready. And we knew we weren't quite ready, but we thought it was going to be fine, and we would manage fine. And it was a real watershed moment when we realised we'd made a terrible mistake. The game wasn't right, wasn't stable, and we had to get back and finish it.
It's very easy, if you're in a hurry to get a game out, to underestimate exactly what state it's in when it comes to bugs. Right? And that's I don't think people quite realise how, when you're making that go, no-go decision on whether you'll launch a game, you have to make that decision a long, long time before the game is actually released. It's like firing a shotgun, really. Once you pull the trigger, you can't actually stick the bullets back down the barrel. It's coming out, and that's what we found with Rome 2. For
me, it was watershed within the studio to see the disappointment within the team, because actually Rome 2 kind of sold okay in its, in its release, and it's very easy to go, hey everybody, everything's fine because we're still selling games. But the team were just so unhappy. The fans' response, that's absolutely what they're looking for, and Total War fans are not quiet. They don't keep it to themselves. They tell us, and we want to hear it, and we will try and make things right. So Viking came out on the last day of Sega's financial year, right? That's kind of because it had to be done. And the team itself didn't know what it was there for, right? This console team that had existed in CA for a long time, but it had kind of run out of ideas. And they'd gone to Sega, interestingly, and they'd said, what game do you want us to make next? Which was a typical developer-publisher relationship in those days, 10 years ago. We were asked in an Olympics game. I don't know whether you've ever played an Olympics game, right? But you don't want to do 30 different mini games in a major game. So we decided, right, well, let's go out and find something that feels appropriate for us. And obviously Sega had this Alien license that had been used on some games before, and Alien Colonial Marines was in development then.
They were making 3 games based on the Alien license with Fox, one of which wasn't going particularly well, and they thought there was an opportunity that we could think about there. And the one that wasn't going well wasn't Colonial Marines, Jesus. How bad could that one have been?
We kind of sat back a bit and went, do you know what? Nobody's done a survival horror game, and we could use the same technology as we used on Viking actually for an Alien game. Al Hope kind of set out a 5-page kind of vision document of what an Alien survival horror game would be, and Sega went, there is no way we want to do another Alien game, right? No chance. So go back, think again. Won't you, please, will you do an Olympics game, please? And we went, right, the only way to really do this is Skunk works it. So we did a demo in 5 weeks, and we didn't tell Sega we were doing it, and we used the tech from Viking.
So we had this idea for a game, a survival horror game based in the Alien universe. And so we got permission to put together a small, more of a mood demo of what it'd be like to just be in that space.
And we went in and we also did a bit of work with Sega in that we showed some of the actual games players at Sega this demo. And so there was a kind of voice of opinion already in the room when we eventually showed it to the execs at Sega. And when we showed it to the execs, they were kind of like, oh wow, this looks pretty good. And then they had everybody around them go, this is a great game, it's going to be great.
I think we're kind of born out of a desire for kind of authenticity. Alien Isolation was very authentic to the original Alien movie. It's an extension and an expansion of that original universe. You know, and with Halo Wars as well. You know, we're considered a safe pair of hands who understand other people's IPs. You know, we can be respectful and reverent of and dig in and understand the nature of an IP extremely well.
We'd actually got to the point where we could start running 2 teams in parallel, and that meant we could do something else. And we'd finally got to the point where we could start working on a Warhammer game without slowing down the pace at which we were doing the historical games. And in a way, there's not that much difference between making a historical Total War and making a Warhammer game. And that rather than being authentic to history, we end up being authentic to this IP that already exists. It means, what we actually end up doing is very similar. We go out and we do our research and we immerse ourselves totally in the content, which is why I ended up painting a lot of figures and fighting a lot of tabletop games. We toyed with the idea of doing another fantasy IP. I mean, we thought about doing Lord of the Rings games and various other things, right? But up to that point, we'd never really been able to do it without having to make a choice between historical or fantasy, and we didn't want to do that. We always wanted to do both. So it was the first point where we could.
It takes a long time to produce something, and by the end of it, actually, we're all hyped about doing something a little bit different. It's like, okay, this really worked, but let's do something different. And Warhammer, it being fantasy, was obviously a big opportunity to go a little bit crazy with how the style could be so different from what we'd done previously on historical titles. Really excited for all the artists, definitely, and the animators, all the creatures they get to work on. It's very different, and it had to look different. And it had to be in keeping with, obviously, all the Warhammer fans and what they were expecting to see.
Everything we do is kind of, what do the Total War players need? And then what works within the parameters of the lore. Then we speak to Games Workshop about those things to kind of just get a feel for it. I think things that are important IP-wise, players generally speaking, I think, key characters, the way they look, what their core mechanics are in an army book, like that's all there and available to us to know beforehand. So I think it's about the trust that we both have in each other, understanding each other's requirements and needs.
Recently we had a new member join our team as a trainee, and the first thing I did was like, okay, here's the design documents, just read through and just immerse yourself in the lore of Warhammer. And it might not all make sense at first, but you kind of just have to imagine, just take a bit of time reading the lore and just think about the world that you're going to be working within, and you really do have to just become a part of it. And I will say myself, I'm no Warhammer expert. Every time we have a new lore pack, I'm like, I have to learn what these new characters are and the history behind them. But the design are really good at creating documents to just explain all of that, or we have quick meetings to give an overview, so everyone's on the same page as as to who these people are and their backstory and everything.
How does Total War change when you introduce magic and dragons?
Surprisingly little in some ways. I mean, it's still fundamentally the same experience. You're still, when you're on the battlefield, you've still got this handful of units, and you can see an army opposite you, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the combination of things? Where do I need to put these guys, and what order do I need to do things in? So the core gameplay is not different. You just got more toys, and they're a bit more whizzy. The tabletop game, it inspires what we do. It doesn't, we're not bound by it in any particular way. It's one of the things Games Workshop says is that none of the computer versions of any of their stuff is exactly the same as the tabletop. They're all different, right? So we created our own thing, which was Total War Warhammer. And so long as we're completely faithful to their IP, they're completely happy with what we do.
I mean, we're quite a long way into the process of working with the Warhammer world and obviously the community. Yeah, we've gotten a good pace of what people expect and how to respond and what things are the most important to respond to. And like I said, the designers are now so immersed in the whole Warhammer lore. They blow me away with like all the detail they come out with. It's just like it is real history. It's just amazing. You could have a degree in Warhammer, I think.
What fantasy or fictional worlds work for a Total War game, do you think?
So we have a long list, that we kind of keep up to date, and we do talk to other IP holders as well, other games companies' IP, through to things we're seeing on Netflix and Amazon Prime, etc., day to day. So nothing's off limits. It's more kind of opportunity cost in a way of what do we really want to do and what uses Total War well. I think Warhammer shows that Total War can work with an IP really, really well and still be Total War. It doesn't lose anything in that only games. So yeah, we'll see where we end up with.
I think with Warhammer, I mean, a lot of our core historical fans came with us, on the Warhammer adventure. So, we can see that a lot of the players who played the historical games also play Warhammer. I think we were aware of that whenever we're making a historical game after Warhammer, you can't ignore the fact that that game exists and it has dragons and fiery things all over the place. And if we're not careful, we end up making the historical games look a bit dull by comparison. And with Three Kingdoms, having the romance mode helped with that a bit. It meant that we could have larger-than-life characters. It's not full-on magic in any way. It's firmly authentic to the Three Kingdoms novel and so on. But those characters are larger than life from a historical point of view. So it's different, right? We end up with a game which is, it isn't Warhammer. It's different from Warhammer. It has its own charm, its own beauty, its own depth, its own interest, and I think there's plenty of room to do that, to be able to flip between fantasy and having all of the weird and wonderful stuff, and then something which is a bit more grounded but feels more real as well. Having those two modes, it was there right from the start. I mean, I don't think we would have made the game without that. Particularly for an Eastern audience, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel is so well known. You couldn't cover that period in history without people looking at it and thinking you were doing it wrong, right? Because they wouldn't recognise it. It's hard for a Western audience to understand how deeply rooted or that particular novel is in that culture. Getting the Three Kingdoms content right for an Asian audience was super important. I think the character features in Three Kingdoms has changed things slightly. It's interesting because that was when we started. That was one of the things where we weren't absolutely sure that would actually work. The idea of building networks of relationships between characters and using that to drive recruitment and so on. It was quite a big departure but now that we've got there with it and it works really well, I can see us pushing forward and developing that further for other titles in other periods of history where that character focus makes sense. I mean, it'll depend on the period. I mean, there are some periods where it was all about characters and relationships, and there are other periods where it is more about states and policies and so on. So it'll depend on the period.
You're not going to have Napoleon holding like a bridge on his own then or anything?
Probably not on his own. So I think it is important to have a balance between doing the popular content that everybody already knows and that they can revel in and go, yay, I understand this, and going out and finding something that is off the beaten track, a bit more interesting, and actually going, here is all this really interesting stuff that you never knew existed, and putting that in front of people. So I think a balance between the two. I think we should be doing both, and we will keep doing both.
Where we're at now and where we were 20 years ago, it is incredibly different. But it has been a slow kind of step-by-step path to get where we're at. You know, I guess Sega buying CA in 2005 was probably the most dramatic thing. And the core fundamental difference is once we were owned by Sega, we felt like there was stability. When you're working for an independent game developer that's going from publisher to publisher, obviously it can go wrong badly at any time. So Sega came in. I guess we had a little bit of trepidation. We didn't know how they were going to handle it, but they've been brilliant. They've been amazing. Could not ask for a better publisher than Sega. You know, we feel like whatever games we're working on, we're going to finish them, they're going to ship, and they're going to be, you know, now we think they're going to be in good shape when they go out.
We used to get physical copies of the new games that came out that Sega released, and everyone would just queue up massively all down the office, just waiting for their physical copy of something. And when I talk about that now, people are like, what box games? What are you on about? Get Steam keys. But it was just that whole, that change of technology that's just happened over those years, and how we interact with community so much more now. We used to have our biggest releases on PC Gamer magazine, and it was like, we're on the front cover, this is amazing, and everybody get copy. It's like physical things that we used to get, and now it's a bit different, but it's a wider audience, so it's exciting in a different way.
There are core values which the genesis of Creative Assembly and the early years have brought along with them. It's impossible. There's enough people from those early years still around that some of those core values I think are there. Like we're a very collaborative studio. We have a management hierarchy, but that doesn't mean that anybody on any team can't come up with a great idea and it be acted upon.
So it's been really interesting seeing how some things have changed, going from 5 to 500, but some things have stayed exactly the same. The kind of core values that we work to really have stayed the same all the way through, and we've always had a really strong focus on quality, and that's one of the things that Tim Ansell, the founder of the company, he set that really strongly to the point where he'd rather the studio closed than made a bad game, and he would say that quite regularly to publishers. It meant from a publisher's point of view, he was a nightmare to negotiate with, but from an indie dev's point of view, he was brilliant. Right? He was really, really good.
What do you think of Creative Assembly now? Do you follow the work much, or do you have any sort of feelings about, I visited there a few weeks ago, and it's one of the biggest employers in the UK games industry, and it started out of your spare bedroom. What does it feel like looking at a company that's grown to such a size, and it started with you?
Well, it's obviously a fact that fills me with immense pride, but it's kind of weird because, I guess we haven't been in contact, and it almost feels like kind of two separate lives for me, really. It kind of feels like I died and was reborn, so it's almost quite hard for me to connect that was actually even me. Funny, I actually often find it a bit upsetting playing the Total War games. It just kind of brings all of that stuff back, and I kind of prefer just to focus on what I got rather than what I haven't.
Have you managed to speak to some of those people in the years since?
No, not really. I mean, like I said, partly, I literally never went back in the office. All my stuff was literally left there, and subsequently, I believe, put in a box, and I never even collected that. So I literally have not set foot in the office since that day. It just felt too awkward for me to do so. And strangely, they never contacted me for anything. So, for instance, even when they had things like their 25 or 30 year anniversaries, nobody thought that I might be a part of that, having been, completely like the #1 person for 18 of those 25 years. But so I don't know. So they don't keep in contact with me, and I don't really keep in contact with them.
Yeah, well, yeah, a couple of people that we interviewed did want me to mention that you are always welcome back there.
Oh, okay.
Tim mentioned it, and
look, I love that product. I love the people. I love the company. There are so many people in that company more intelligent than me, much more creative than me, and that's a wonderful environment to be in. And it's not average. You know, it's not what you bump into in your average supermarket.
Tim Ansell has yet to take up that offer to revisit the studio he once founded. Perhaps it's one he'll need to hear for himself to truly believe, but those early days of Creative Assembly remain an incredibly important period in his life. From his spare bedroom grew a company that is now hundreds strong, a team that is right this moment supporting two very different flavours of Total War, both historical and fantasy, as well as working away on a yet-to-be-seen tactical first-person shooter. Those days of contract work with FIFA and whatever sports titles he could get a hold of may now be distant memories that only a few at CA can even claim to remember, but they did help pave the way for what has now become one of the brightest names in British game development and an all-time great when it comes to grand strategy. Cool. I think we've got most of it. Yeah. Thank you for revisiting those years. Yeah.
Pleasure.
And allowing us to come and look at this ridiculous view as well. Cool.
And thanks, Sega, for this.
Yeah.
A strike! The goalie made a meal of that one. Well in by Damji. Nigeria caught offside. Free kick to be taken by Baldinho. Header by Abuka. Nigeria offside. Free kick to be taken by Capriossi. Della Savia. Santa Maria. Good control by Santa Maria. A shot! Saved by Naboku. Walter.
Move out quickly! For China! Ready. Take heed, warriors!